Hey YouTube, going to be doing something a little different today. My little girl is going to be turning 6 years old, and she is quite the artist. So I want to make her a really neat drawing table with a tilt top so she can use it like an easel or a drafting table, or she can lay it flat, do projects on it, because she's a real crafter. She loves crafting and drawing and making things. So what we're going to be doing today, what I'm going to be doing, ain't no we to it, is I'm going to be slicing and dicing on a sheet of red oak plywood. So have a look. Hey, look at that. It looks like a shop. Isn't that amazing? Unfortunately, this part does not look like a shop. This is all my wife's crap that I have to store in my... We have no more storage outside anymore. I tore down the shed. So it was really my fault. I could have just left her crap out there rusting and rotting away. But as you can see, it's her motorcycle and all her totes and all this garbage taken up, I would say, a good quarter of my shop, which does irritate me. But the rest of it, hey, looks just like a shop, don't it? So here's the red oak plywood, and I've got some stuff here called veneer edging. It's really just edge banding. Put it on with an iron, and you can get this at Lowe's. It's about $7-8 a roll, 25 foot of it. And you put that on the edges of the plywood to make people think that it's an actual piece of real wood. It just sort of finishes everything off. You know, even though it's just for my kid, I still want to try and do a nice job of it. And here, let me show you my plans. I've got plans. Thought about how I wanted to do this, so one of the things that I did, of course, is I made my cut list. This is, I'm going to lay out my cuts on my piece of ply here so I don't waste anything. And then here's a side view pretty much of the tilting table. You may not be able to make much of it, but basically it's going to be about 22 inches deep. It's going to be about 33 inches wide, and the top of it's going to be 24 inches deep. So should be a nice little surface for her to hang out and do her stuff on. Okay, so stay tuned as I get into the layout and stuff, and I'll show you some techniques for how to deal with a large piece of plywood if you happen to have a small table saw and you just can't run it through there sideways and do all your cuts and stuff. Sometimes you have to cut on the bench. Alright, I'm not going to cover every tiny little detail of this, but obviously you're doing some layout. You're going to need a pencil, you're going to need a tape measure. You're going to need a straight edge, because even though I'm going to be using this clamping guide here to guide my little panel cutting saw, I'm going to want to know that my panel cutting saw isn't screwing up. So it's good to put a very light line. You're going to have to erase it later or cut it off, right? So you put little light lines where you want to cut your material. Now this panel cutting saw, okay, it's 5/8 from here to here. So when I want to cut, I'm going to want to clamp this is a very interesting tool to have. If you don't have one, you should think about getting a clamp and tool guide. You can run routers, saws, whatever you want off of it. And what it does is when you hit this lever, it clamps across your whole sheet, so you can run your saw right along it and just cut. Things you should know about, okay? If this piece is important and you want to make sure that if you screw up, you don't go into your piece and screw it all up and you have a little room to make waste over here, always put your guide on the piece you want to keep, so that if your blade does walk off or something weird happens, it'll happen to the waste, okay? So I'm going to clamp this up, and I'll show you how that... Okay, now you remember I said I wanted 3 5/8 for my clamp here. And I want to tell you something about tape measures, okay? This little foot here moves back and forth. There's a reason for that. Okay? It's to account for the thickness of that foot when you're doing rough measuring out in the field. For precise measuring, you either want to use a steel rule, okay? Or you can also cut an inch. It's a very common thing for woodworkers and builders to do, is instead of measuring 3 5/8, I measure 4 5/8 to my line, and then I make my mark at the 1 inch mark. That way you're getting a very precise mark. If you just mark against this, it's pretty good for most things, but for cabinet building you want to be as precise as you possibly can so that all your little mistakes don't add up to more than maybe a 1/16 or less once you're all done. Okay, you see that little mark? That's how us old-timey carpenters do it. It's called a crow's nose, okay? And what you want to do when you're making a mark, okay, yeah, you can make a little straight line, but what if that straight line's crooked? Okay, you could wonder, hey, which part of that straight line am I supposed to measure to? Well, the crow's nose tells you. Another thing to remember, when you are measuring and laying out marks, keep your ruler parallel. Okay, if I were to measure over like this, I'm not really measuring 3 5/8 over. I'm measuring less, because at an angle you get less and less and less. So make sure you stay parallel, make sure that you cut an edge, make sure you make a mark that you can read perfectly. Now, if I was using a square, I wouldn't have to do a crow's nose. I just lay my square up there and make a little square mark. But that's good enough for what I need to do. Okay, when you're cutting, whatever side you want to show is the side you should be down on the bench, because as you can see, the teeth of the blade are going to lift up. That's going to tend to make a little splinter all the way along that. Now, you can score this with a razor knife to minimize tear out, okay? Because as the blade comes up, it has a tendency to lift this veneer off the plywood and make a ragged edge. So that's also something you should definitely do, and I'll be doing that. I'm not going to show you because I have to use both my hands to lay that down, but I'm going to score my razor mark right into this pencil line using my straight edge and a couple clamps, make sure I got it right. And I just wanted to show you, you don't want your blade to go through the material too far, especially if you have something that you're cutting underneath it. Now, this bench is very old and I have to replace the top anyway soon, so I'm not going to worry about putting cutting sticks under it, but normally you would put some cutting sticks under your panel so that it would support it on both sides of your cut, so that the panel doesn't hinge or break as you're cutting it, and it keeps it off of whatever surface you're cutting. But in this case, I'm going to cut straight on the bench because it doesn't matter. And as you can see, I've got a little rocking when my blade touches the bench, so I'm coming down maybe a 1/16 into my bench. No big deal. Alright, now that I've got my cuts made here, okay, see they came out pretty nice, I can now use my table saw for sizing things, you know, because table saw only goes up to 24. I need to make a 22-inch piece, so the obvious thing to do is to run it through the saw. But I'll tell you right now, you don't want to set your saw to 22. Set your saw to about 22 1/8 or thereabouts, so that you can trim off this factory edge. If you feel this factory edge with your finger, it is quite rough, and I have to be able to stick that veneer edge onto it, that banding. So the way to get a real smooth edge, in this case, because I have a nice table saw blade right here, with a close tooth count, right, would be to clean up that old factory edge. So I'm going to be setting my saw to 22 1/8, running both pieces, and then setting it to 22 and running both pieces. And I'll be doing that for all the parts throughout. These parts are going to make up more of the structural components, the bottom of the little drawer that's in the top underneath the desk, and then the stiffening parts. And then this part right here is going to be the part that's actually going to be the table that gets drawn on. Okay, as you can see, I'm getting along here. This is going to be assembled this way eventually. I was just testing, make sure my widths had worked out right now. But as you can see, I got some edge banding on there. And I'm going to tell you something about this edge banding, man. Nothing, you just can't count on anything being of quality anymore. There was a time when you could buy edge banding and never worry about it being wide enough to cover your plywood. But I'm going to show you something right now, man. It's very, very frustrating to me as a carpenter, is that this edge banding, as you can see, is almost a 1/16 of an inch narrower than this other roll of edge banding. This edge banding is actually too fucking narrow to actually cover, did I get it? There it is. To cover the ply. So I ended up with tiny little gaps, which, you know, I'm not too concerned with. It's not a big deal. I'm going to put plenty of polyurethane on it and it'll all look fine, but it's just frustrating. You should end up, when you finish ironing this on with your iron and rubbing it down with a rubbing block and everything, you should end up with just a fuzz on each side. And you can knock that down with some sandpaper and a sanding block, or you can use a edge band trimmer or whatever you like. But it's frustrating when you go and you buy something, two rolls of something, and one of them is a 1/16 inch too narrow. I mean, this is basically defective. If I had really been picky about it, I would have just returned it. But, you know, that's where it goes. But I just wanted to show you how once you get this on, what you do is you test it by lifting up. See if it's really on there. So it's on there, okay. Then you put your sanding block on it, okay. And what you do is you sand and angle down. Sand and angle down. And what that'll do is it'll weaken this edge, and then you can just snap and crack, and then you just go along and sand it. And that's basically what I've been doing all along. And you end up with, you know, a pretty decent edge. This is the piece that's too narrow. I don't know if you can see it. I can see it. It's just a little bit too narrow. Shows just a little bit of the end grain, but it'll all work out. And I just wanted to show you guys the view out my window. This is one of the things I really enjoy about working in my shop out here. Is no matter how grumpy or depressed I might be, if I come out here and start working in my shop and looking out my window at this beautiful woods all around me, it's hard to stay grumpy, let me tell you. See, the reason I think it's important to have a little bit hanging over, see, this is the part I haven't quite gotten to yet, is that as you sand it, because there's adhesive on it and whatnot, it rolls that edge. Let's just wait for the camera to dial in on it. Is it going to? Hello? Okay, as you can see, it rolls that edge, and it just makes such a nice finished product. If the edge band is too narrow, and it shows a little bit of the end grain, you get an edge here that could catch either this veneer or this veneer and tear it. But when you roll that edge with that little bit of adhesive on it, it just makes a wonderfully smooth edge that you don't have to worry about anything getting torn loose later. So it's important that your edge band hang over just about a 32nd on each side. Okay guys, got all the edge banding on, and before I assemble, it's a lot easier to do all the sealing work and build up when everything's flat, because it's a heck of a lot easier to sand. So I'm going to show you a little technique. Okay, it's not a big deal. You use one of these white foam rollers. I like the small ones. This, and then you just get the material spread out onto there. You don't have to worry too much about. You don't want to push hard because you just make more bubbles. And you don't want to worry about too much about what it's looking like when you first get it on there. What you want to do is just make sure you don't drool any of it over the edges unnecessarily. Okay. And once you get it on, let me just get this on there right quick. It's kind of a humid day, so I've got plenty of time before it dries. It's not like it's a hot, dry day where I would have a lot of trouble. But you don't want any dry spots. They call them holidays. That's what we used to call them when I was doing bright work on boats. No holidays. Make sure everything is coated with a pretty nice wet coat, because this raw veneer is very thirsty. So your first coat can be kind of heavy. Doesn't hurt to thin the coat, but I'm just using this straight out of the can. This is just Minwax Gloss Poly. So you can kind of see what I got here. You can see the wetness, and you can see I'm making a lot of bubbles. So that doesn't look too good, does it? I mean, that would be a pain in the ass to sand later, wouldn't it? And then you take a brush. Now you can use a foam brush, but foam brushes have a tendency to leave bubbles behind as well. And all you want to do is just lightly, I'm just using the weight of the brush, not even pushing down on it. And all I'm doing is, this is called tipping off. This is a classic technique for applying finishes rapidly. You roll it on, you tip it off. What does the tipping do? It kills the bubbles, pops the bubbles, and it also, if you have too much material one place and not enough somewhere, it does have a tendency to spread it out. Now I'm using a dry brush. The only material on the brush is what I'm picking up as I tip. I don't care about having the brush wet. I don't want the brush wet. Okay. I'm just showing this to you. This might help you sometime if you ever have to do a whole big area. Right now I'm doing almost an entire 4x8 sheet, both sides, and I got to do it rapidly. Okay, I don't have a lot of time to make this project happen. So now, can you see the difference? Okay, now this will lay down. Okay, see how it lays down? This Minwax polyurethane gloss lays down pretty nice. See? Now that's just the first coat, so it is going to be hairy and rough. It's just the way it is. But that's basically what I do to everything. Alright, as you can see, I've got my first sealer coat on one side. And I want to show you a little trick, because I'm going to come back and hit up the other side in a couple hours when I can flip them over when they're dry. If you want to keep using your roller and brush, the best thing to do is to use a nice clean plastic bag and completely cover the roller and the brush, and that'll keep it from drying out enough that you can use it again. You can't do that forever, but you can definitely get a few uses out of it. Another good thing to use is these little cheapo plastic liners, because this is not going to be useful later. I got to toss this. Okay, but you can just take a look at the results. You see it's not perfect, but this is a sealer coat. The way to get an excellent gloss on anything is to put many thin coats of poly on it if you're using poly. You don't want to put a big thick slabbery coat on it. It won't dry. Poly is very funny like that. It needs to be very thin to dry, especially for the follow-up coats. This coat can be a little thick like I put it on now. This is pretty thick. If I did it this thick on the follow-up coat, it would take forever to dry, and it might even alligator or orange peel from having too much on it. But yeah, we're getting there. Now I didn't stain these or anything. I like it natural. But if you do stain, you've got to wait at least 24 hours for the solvents in the stain to kick off, or the poly will not grab sufficiently well, and you can have things screw up on you. So we'll come back to this later, and I'll show you some more.